Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. And my name is Jon Toigo. I wear many hats, and many times it's an advocate for archive and data management, since I'm the chairman of the Data Management Institute. Originally, the topic was framed as a question, and it was, is there an ideal platform for archive? And then later on, SpectraLogic decided to change that to, is disk now a viable solution for archive? I thought long and hard about these things, and my first reaction, seriously, was to say, you know, it's kind of a stupid question to ask. I mean, at least it's a silly one. I wouldn't say it's stupid, but you know, it suggests that every archive out there is the same sort of beast. Archive is an application, like any other application, if you think about it, and there are different flavors of archive. The two that come to mind immediately are deep archive, which we all understand from our ancient history. It's basically data that has gone to sleep, that's never re-referenced, never changes, and we need to hold on to it for a long period of time. That has a certain kind of set of requirements that are that must be met in order to hold that data reliably and with high integrity and at the lowest possible price point, and in a manner that befits its access frequency. So a different set of needs and requirements there from what we would call an active archive, which is they say it's a newer definition. Frankly, I think it goes back to the original purpose of tape in most organizations. Data is still referenced occasionally. You still view the data, or you still retrieve the data, but you hardly ever change it. Today, there are entire industries that work almost exactly on that premise. One would be broadcast and media, where they are only going to shoot the latest inning of a baseball game once, but that data is not going to change. It's going to be permanently stored, and then it'll be accessed on a semi-frequent basis whenever somebody wants to look and see the plays that happened in that inning. So what we're looking at is data that's referenced but seldom change. These different kinds of archives suggest different requirements from archive platforms. So there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-most architecture for archive. I mean, when I go back to my earliest days in IT, this was one of the first charts that was ever presented to me. I think it was in an IBM Red Book on application design. And it basically said that, you know, you look at the business process, you create a business application to help automate part of that process, or you conceptualize it, and then you think about what the data flows in and out are to that application, and you get some of the characteristics of what will be required to host the data. So your analysis of the business process will identify things like, are there retention and deletion requirements around the data? Are there integrity requirements around the data? Do we need to handle that data as a high criticality asset that requires restore priority if there's ever an interruption? And then conversely, on the other side, you have on the business application side questions that just go into the design of the platform that's going to host that application. So what do we expect the volume and growth of data to be? What do we expect the volatility, the change rate of that data to be? What are the access requirements going to be? What are the security requirements going to be? And then we're going to basically come up with a specification and on how we're going to host the data. We're going to look at what services are required in terms of protection and integrity and archive and governance. And then on the other side, we're going to look at the physical infrastructure requirements, the resources that are required, what type of media is best to store that data on, what interface should we be using, what kind of interconnect should connect the users to the data, and any kind of special performance enhancement features. So basically, that's the way we've always tried to figure out what the best platform was for an application. And as I said, archive is nothing if not another application. Well, is disk a suitable platform for archive? Clearly, that decision's already been made. I mean, if you look at Gartner's Magic Quadrant WOO on Enterprise Information Archive, a lot of the archive vendors, or a lot of the vendors who are in their Magic Quadrant, offer specifically disk arrays with deduplication or compression as their preferred archive platform. That allows you to squeeze a lot of data onto the smallest number of spindles. An interesting concept. I don't know if I want to do that, because the archive algorithm, the deduplication algorithm is something I'm going to have to hold on to and preserve and make sure I can use for as long as I'm holding on to the data. If this is a deep archive, that may get me into trouble at some point when technology moves afar from the original dedupe algorithm that was used to compress the data or reduce the data or whatever. ESG, on the other hand, another analyst group, is claiming that roughly half of the archive activity that's being done today or shortly will be done using disk as the archive media. So I guess the point is that the analysts are already projecting that a lot of people are using disk for archive. And there's a foundation of the case for using disk-based archiving that can't be dismissed readily. One is the familiarity of disk technology. Everybody knows how to write data to a disk and how to copy that data to another disk. So people think that archive is simply making a copy of the data to another set of disks. There's also the comparative ease of deployment. People are familiar with how to stick some disk out there, whether it's a network attached or direct attached configuration of one sort or another, and more or less they know how to migrate data over to that. So, theoretically, disk enjoys the benefits of ease of use, ease of deployment. And of course, we have seen outstanding improvements in disk capacity over the years. We started out, and heck, I'm dating myself, but the first disk drive, those RAMAC drives, if you ever saw the Apollo 13 movie with Tom Hanks, he points over his shoulder and he says, points to the vehicle assembly building, he says, we can store over 8K of data in that building. And he was referring to these big gigantic refrigerator-sized disk arrays that could store 8K of data on a platter. Well, we certainly moved forward from there. Now we're up into I guess it's 6 terabytes now on a helium-filled disk drive with 5 platters instead of 4. That's where we're at right now, and there are some capacity jumps that are coming in the future. So disk is, since from about 1984 until present day, and it's kind of flatlined a little bit now, but it has delivered 100% improvement or doubling of capacity about every 18 months. That slowed down about a year and a half, 2 years ago, but it's poised again to jump forward as Hammer and bit pattern media and other technologies are brought online in the disk world. So we have increasing capacity, so we're going to use fewer spindles to store more data. That's a good thing for archive. And then, of course, there's the availability of this value-add technology that Gartner likes to crow about, the data reduction and compression technologies. I see them as not necessarily ideally suited to the archive play. If I'm using disk, I'd rather keep it as clean as possible without a bunch of interfering technology, but we'll get into that in a minute. Okay, now, disk also has a few drawbacks. You can count these off. Acquisition cost is certainly one of them. I mean, if you're going to add deduplication software to a disk array, count on increasing tremendously the cost of that disk array. I mean, one of the first deduplicating arrays that entered the market a couple of years ago was about $3,000 worth of hard disks, and the manufacturer suggested retail on it was $410,000, and that was because of deduplication software that was joined at the hip to a proprietary controller. So, when you think about it, that's certainly jacked up the price of the underlying disk, and that can be a drawback. Secondly, you got bit error rates on disk, which is something that's only now being explored in detail. You're looking at 1 out of every 90 1 terabyte SATA drives are going to have a non-recoverable and usually undetected bit error on them. If that happens in a spot where you're just writing a file, that may make one file unretrievable. However, if it happened in a RAID stripe or something, might destroy an entire RAID set, and you might not even know that until you go to retrieve the data again. So the bit error rate tends to be a little bit of a concern. Energy consumption is also a huge concern. I think I showed in the last webinar that we did studies that have been done last year by INSEEK and by Clipper Group that showed that the cost of energy of a disk-based archive platform is 500 times the cost of a comparable tape-based platform. So energy, where that is a concern, and the cost of energy is going to be factored into the choice of your archive platform. And then you have other issues here. I look at siloing, the proprietary designs of a lot of disk arrays as an inhibitor to their use as an archive platform. It's difficult to migrate between different vendors' gear. Are you actually going to buy a disk platform and then keep it under glass? And just to make sure that you're going to be able to retrieve the data from it at some point. There's also a lack of standards in some of these technologies that are being value added to the disk arrays, data reduction and compression, and they're also generally very poor hardware management capabilities in disk infrastructure. I've been complaining about that for a long time. I call it the Holy Grail. No vendors seem to want to work together to ensure the common manageability of their hardware platform, and that bodes ill for the availability of that disk platform when you need it. Now, tape obviously provides the alternative that I like, and especially when you use as an adjunct on tape the new technologies, IBM's linear tape file system, what SpectraLogic has been doing, integrating object content into archives and LTFS via their Black Pearl server technology. I encourage you to learn more about that if you haven't heard about it. And of course, tape, like disk, is growing in capacity by leaps and bounds. The current innovations around barium ferrite technology, for example, in media coding that allows you to do perpendicular magnetic recording to disk the way that or to tape the way you've already been able to do it to disk. There have been demonstrations of 35 terabyte capacity LTO cartridges. I hope that we'll see those within the next 12 to 18 months. That will certainly be a game changer. I mean, you can already get the greatest storage density available from using tape, but in the smallest footprint with the least energy consumption. But now you're going to be able to grow that by leaps and bounds. So capacity, resiliency, the economy of scale, these are all arguments that are very much in favor of using tape as an archival platform. But let's not forget that tape also has some rough edges. One of the major obstacles is the millennials, the newbies in the IT space, oftentimes have no knowledge of tape. They weren't even using tape cassettes in their cars when they were kids. I mean, they have had no reason to interact with tape at all. Everything's electronic. It's downloaded from a cloud automatically to their iPod, and they listen to their music that way. I had a guy come up to me after a talk in London, and he asked, with a straight face, I mean, he couldn't have been more than 20 years old, but he asked me, why do I have to build a room with books in it to operate my tape system? And I could not figure out where he was getting a room with books in it. And then it dawned on me, he had never heard the expression tape library. So we have a familiarity gap in the latest cadre of IT professionals that are coming up through the ranks we're going to have to address. Access speeds can also be an issue in certain kinds of archives. You want to have instantaneous access to your data. If you're using a tape solution, chances are you're going to have that mitigated a little bit by the requirement for a robot to pick the tape out of a library shelf and then insert it into the drive and then to spin it up to the point where the file begins. File systems like LTFS they're optimized really for long block files, not for a bunch of small files. So unless you're going Black Pearl or something, LTFS tape may not deliver the kinds of performance that you want from archive retrieval. But again, that's assuming that you're using the archive in a frequently reaccessed manner. Now, that's not sufficient cause. None of those things are sufficient cause to count tape out. In fact, there are workarounds for most of them. And even the deduplicating disk array guys, at least in the past, were willing to basically agree that tape still had its role. There's a very telling quote here that Shane Jackson, who's previously a director of product marketing for Data Domain before it was acquired by EMC, said way back in 1990, I think they wished the Internet didn't have a memory, so they could get away from saying it. But they were basically saying that using tape was still a very reasonable thing to do. All right, so it's time for some sanity. Archive is an application that has its own personality, and maybe instead of talking about it in terms of disk versus tape, which is what you normally read in all the magazine articles, maybe all of the above is the better strategy. I came up with this bumper sticker, coexist. It's patterned on another one, but frankly, I think there's a role for disk and tape in archive. In fact, if you think about it, you might recall a couple of years ago we were talking about DDT. We were talking about disk to tape. And that was the idea of tiering your storage, that your production data was first written to disk, and then it got moved into a second strata of disk, what we would call active archive disk maybe, and then ultimately it moved back into tape where deep archive lived. And that's still a very viable model for an awful lot of companies, and it's certainly worth looking at, especially if that second tier of archival disk is not overly encrusted with value-add software that costs a ton of money and jacks up the price of that second tier of disk. I believe last time we spoke, I talked about how a tiered model could save dramatically on the cost. I mean, if you look at a 100 terabyte system, you're talking about $750,000 for just 2 tiers of disk, versus deploying a multi-tier with tape environment. It would cost you half that amount. So anyway, this is still a viable model and a good way to think about using disk and tape both in various aspects of archive. Disk also makes a great cache in front of tape. LTFS, as I said before, sometimes suffers from the fact that people want to access the file without the worldwide wait. And you've got a little bit of waiting time when you go to access a file, even though it's represented like any other NAS head as just a file system. It'll take between 20 milliseconds and 2 minutes to grab the right tape to spin it up and to get to the front of the file. A lot of folks who are offering front-end LTFS heads to your tape storage have actually added some caching of the files, file stubs, if you will, so that when you first ask for a file that's out on the LTFS repository, it begins to spin out the first few gigabytes of that file while it's doing the search and the lookup, because it's got that portion of the file stored on a disk cache. So that basically masks or spoofs, if you will, the delay or the lag that's required for accessing that particular file. Now with Black Pearl, the disk provides another function. In addition to a cache, it provides a preparatory area where you can coalesce all these small files and things into a bucket, an object bucket, before writing it to LTFS, and then you can basically retrieve the entire bucket and all the files that are associated with it back into disk when you need to view them again. So again, disk is ideally purposed as a cache, a front-end cache to tape. So why not an all-of-the-above strategy with some disk-based storage for active archive and some tape for deep archive? I mean, that's kind of matching the infrastructure to the data access requirements and the anticipated growth rate of the infrastructure. And it leverages the complementarity of magnetic storage media technologies, even in so-called clouds. In fact, I've recently been asked by a major vendor, I won't say which one, to help them explore the possibility of creating what they're calling FLAPE, which is flash memory as your primary storage, writing immediately to a tape backend, LTFS. Kind of an interesting idea, although I hate the name. Okay, so 6 criteria for building an effective archive platform. I hope that Spectre will jump on this and flesh them out a little bit. First of all, you're going to have to know your data. How much is there? What are the access characteristics of that data? That will decide, whether disk or tape may be the better solution, or a combination of the both. And think about ingestion. How are you moving data from your primary storage environment into the archive environment? You're going to have to support those interconnects. Then you're going to have to think about verification. You're going to want to make sure that the data that you're committing for preservation reasons, usually for reasons having to do with mandatory regulations and laws on data preservation, you're going to want to verify that you've written it in a readable way and that it's going to work just fine. Then you're going to have to think about space, not just the space of the media itself and how much elbow room there is for writing data on it, but also how much space it takes up in your data center. This is a platform that's fairly well dedicated to a specific requirement. And like any other platform, you got to measure the number of tiles you got in the raised floor, maybe even consider purchasing the tape solution you need or the disk solution you need from a cloud service provider. Then think about the skills that you have on staff where you're going to have to build in some additional training. If you got a bunch of millennials who don't even know what tape is, you're probably going to have to do a little training. And then you're going to think about TCO, total cost of ownership. And that's really where the rubber meets the road these days, because everybody's a little cost conscious about things. So you're going to want to select the right kind of platform based on the cost of ownership over time. Okay, and then there are probably many more beyond those 6, number 7 and beyond, and I could go on and on and on. But instead, I'm going to turn this over right now to Bruce Kornfeld, who's the Chief Marketing Officer for SpectraLogic Corporation. They're a premier provider of both tape and disk archive platforms, and certainly an innovator, as I've said before, with their deep storage technology and their Black Pearl technologies. Thank you, and welcome, Bruce.
All right, thanks very much. All right, so John, appreciate your time and you setting the stage for your input on how things should go. I know it's just good advice, right? That's all you're doing, is giving the user some ideas on how they can build archives. So what I will say is it seems to me that if you're on the call right now, you're probably in a position where everyone's busy, everyone has lots of action items that you probably haven't done that you need to get done. But if you're on the call right now, you probably have something going on where you're struggling with how do you store lots of data for a long period of time. And there's all sorts of ways to do it. John laid out for you some thoughts on how you can build an archive using disk and tape. Obviously, being a provider of disk and tape, that's a great tie-in for us. And we're going to talk about how SpectraLogic can help you deliver that to your environment, whether it's a large organization, company, whatever you manage in your IT environment. So one of the things that I like to talk about a little bit is the fact that over the last few years, what I see happening is that the growth of data has not slowed down. Everyone's dealing with it. And the concept of getting granular and figuring out which files, which applications need to be stored on which media for certain periods of time, it's hard. It's really hard, and I know a lot of you are struggling with it. So what we've done at Spectra is, we've been known for very large, very dense, very scalable tape libraries for a long time. And over the last year or so, we've introduced disk products, and that's what we want to talk mostly about today. So the first slide you see here is our newest disk product called Tier Verde. We're positioning it as a simply affordable file storage. It is really not put out there for, John talked a lot about these very expensive disk systems that, lo and behold, you can dedupe, and you can lower the effective cost by deduping. We really didn't go after that market. This is for large amounts of files, particularly large files, but large amounts of files that you need to store for a long period of time. You probably want to put it on tape eventually, but let's get it to disk quickly and easily and very, very low cost. So I'm going to talk about this product very briefly, and then I'm going to kind of bridge back to what John was talking about here. So the product that we have is called Tier Verde. We've designed it so that it does not have to be operated or run by anyone that has storage experience. We're seeing less and less of storage experts out there. There's a lot of generalists these days in IT. So we figured, let's make this product as easy to install and easy to use as possible. In fact, without a Spectra person on site, a non-storage person can take it out of the box themselves, rack it, and have it up and running into production within 30 minutes. Very, very simple. We lay out some very simple steps to do it. Obviously, if you want us to help you install it, we will certainly do that, but we have many customers that just do it themselves. And we've designed the user interface to be very simple, so you don't have to understand complicated storage actions in order to manage an Tier Verde. The user interface is very simple. We've designed the outside of it as kind of a shot of what the skins look like with some pretty lights that it can be very easily managed by walking around the data center. You can very easily see if something funky is going on. We also have a smartphone app that you can use to monitor. You probably don't want to provision LUNs and disk pools using the smartphone app. You can, but it certainly can be very useful if you're remote and you just want to make sure that your disk systems are up and running. So we've designed this so it's very, very simple, very easy to expand, very, very easy to use. Next slide, please. It's coming. Okay, and then the next big one is around cost. And disk systems that you're using today, many of you, can be very, very expensive. And that's probably why when you think of archiving and storing massive amounts of data for a long period of time, you probably don't think of disk because it can be expensive. From the major manufacturers, Tier 1 enterprise class disk, and everyone probably has their own price points, but $3, $4, $5 a gigabyte is not unheard of, maybe $2. We've designed this so that we can get down to as low as 48 cents per gigabyte. Still more expensive than tape, but not too much more. But it's a lot less expensive than most Tier 1 disk systems out there. We've designed it so there's no upcharges. I know I've been in the disk industry a long time. I know that disk manufacturers have a tendency to have a very low starting point, but then once you want to add features and software, and then you start adding on the extra software fees. We've designed this so that that's not the case. You pay one price, you get all the features that are in the product. And then on the PS piece, like I said, because of the ease of installation and use, we do not require professional services fees just to get it up and running. So that can be done yourself, or we can help you do it very, very simply. And we have a thing at SpectraLogic that's not just for our disk products, but also for our tape, in that we call it our price lock. And this is going right at a lot of folks, a lot of vendors out there have this tendency to have a very good first-year maintenance cost, and then year 2, 3, 5, 6, it starts to go up significantly, and we don't do that. So we guarantee that the cost of maintenance with SpectraLogic, regardless of the product, will increase no more than the CPI, Consumer Price Index. So that's, I don't know, whatever that is, 1, 2, 3 points a year, something like that. Okay, next slide. And also, if you're going to store data on this thing, particularly massive amounts of data, and it's important data, you need to know that it's not going to go away. So we've designed it to be very, very reliable. We're using one of the biggest things I want to point out is that we're using enterprise class SAS capacity drives. So usually when you see price points for disk under $1 per gig, most of you that are disk savvy probably assumed it was SATA drives, which are consumer grade and have a much higher failure rate. We are using SAS drives. They are 7,200 RPM, so they're not the 15K speed, which we don't need, but they do have the enterprise class reliability, which helps make the system even more reliable. We also have our software gives you lots of options for data redundancy. Within a RAID group, you can have 1, 2, or 3 drive failures without losing data, so we can go up to triple parity. So that helps, and we've done a lot to make sure that the data stays on the drive and it stays reliable. So we have algorithms built in to do checksums and just make sure that we're verifying data on the drives so that we can ensure uptime and that your data will not go away. The bullet about everything you need, nothing you don't is just saying that we've designed the feature functionality specifically for a disk archive. So we've taken out a lot of complicated software features that you don't need when you're storing data to disk in an archive fashion. Okay, just a quick logo slide of some of our customers that are using it very happily, very successfully. We've been shipping, like I said. This particular disk product has been out about 9 months to a year. We've had others before it, but again, starting to get a lot of attention in the market. And most of the customers that you see here are using this as a massive file storage space. Some of them will just keep the data there forever. Some of them will then eventually move the data to tape. All right, and then I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but just so you can see, this is kind of like the spec slide here. We have 2 different models, a 2U version that doesn't expand too much, 220 terabytes, and the 4U model goes up to 1.7 petabytes. It is CIFS and NFS for the front end, so it is expecting file communication on the front end. So that's the way that we store files, and you can see the number of drives that we can support there on the slide. Okay, keep going. So now to tie back to what Jon talked about, I thought it would be fun to give a spectra spin on each of these, if you will. So let me just do a quick time check. We doing okay on time? Okay, we're good. All right. So this is Jon's slide, and I'll just go really quickly through this and just kind of give you our take on the 6 things that Jon just said. So go go off. On Know Your Data, this is just a simple picture of what products we have to offer at SpectraLogic. So the left-hand products are kind of a visual of our tape products, and the right-hand are more disk-related. So really what Jon was saying was make sure you know what the data is and where you think a good place to store it would be. So some of it should go to disk, some of it might go directly to tape. But the message here for Spectra is that no matter what your retention requirements are, your performance requirements and growth requirements, we can absolutely help you architect an archive that makes sense for you. Next slide, thinking about ingestion. So that's a complicated one, whereas what is the data flow? How is data going to move around? Where do you need to send it? So this is kind of a high-level picture of what we have to offer in this area. This might be worth a little bit of time here. So if you're talking about files, clearly we have the ability to send data directly to Verde, like we've been talking about. There's another way to do it too, is many of you are using third-party software to do backup and archive today, and obviously you can still do that. So if you're using a Commvault or Symantec, whatever the case may be, Veeam, you can continue using those software packages, and you can either go to the Verde disk or to our tape systems, and that integration work has been done by SpectraLogic and our software partners. So that's if you're dealing in files or standard backup and archive. Now Jon mentioned Black Pearl, which is the newest product from Spectra, and that's dealing with objects. Now some of you are using object-based storage already, but even if you're not, what Black Pearl does, it takes massive amounts of files that you might want to store for a long time, and we will help you put those into buckets or objects so they can be stored in a massive fashion. So Black Pearl is it's an appliance that front-ends our tape system, but really helps you store a massive amount of files without thinking about it very much, and we will handle the magic on the back end of which tape drive do I write to, how fast do I concatenate on this drive or that drive. We handle all the back-end complexity about tape, of writing to tape and managing tapes. You don't have to be a tape expert at all. You don't have to know how to manage tape drives and cartridges. We've taken all of that and put it into the Black Pearl appliance and helps you store these massive amount of files as objects for long periods of time. So it's kind of, Jon was talking about ingestion. There's all different ways of moving data around to storage. We believe we have lots of options for you, and again, our systems engineers are well trained to help understand your requirements and help you architect the right solution. Jon talked about verification. One of the things, and I think what he was getting at, is how do you know that data that you're writing, whether it's to disk or tape, is going to be readable when you need it? We've been doing some things in the tape world for quite a long time that differentiates us against other tape vendors in our Bluescale software. We do a lot of things that when data gets written to tape, we make sure that it stays readable for a long period of time. So we have media lifecycle management. We have to make sure the physical media stays healthy, so we'll check to make sure tapes can spin inside the cartridge. We make sure there's no damage over time. But we're also doing data integrity verification as well. When the library is not busy, we'll go and load a tape cartridge and we'll just do some data checking to make sure that the data you wrote 5 years ago is still readable. In the disk system, in Verde, we do some very similar things. So we have CRC checksums when we write data to disk, and we also have the ability to verify over time that the data you put on disk is going to be there for a long period of time. Jon talked about space. Data center space obviously is at a premium. Again, I don't know if everyone on the phone has big data centers. I assume some of you do. Some of you may have small little server closets, if you will. But no matter what the case is, space can be very interesting and a big premium these days. So if you look at the left-hand side, that's just kind of a visual showing you that one of the key things that we do as a tape library manufacturer is we're very big on condensing for space. So you can see kind of some visuals there that if you want to store petabytes, or I should say hundreds of petabytes, we have lots of tape products that can do that. And in general, we're a lot less dense we create, I shouldn't say that, more density, yeah. We have more density than our competition, so we take up less floor space in the data center when you're deploying tape solutions. And then if you look on the right-hand side, Verde is a pretty compact product, 1.7 petabytes in a rack, which is, as you all know, is approximately a floor tile. So it's a pretty dense solution. John talked about skills. What kind of people do you have available to manage this archive environment? And like I said earlier, these days, I've talked to a bunch of customers where the skill set, the storage experts aren't common anymore. So we've designed our products to make sure that you don't need super deep storage experts to do all of this stuff, right? So Verde is very, very simple to install and use. Our tape products have a very similar situation. And then TCO. Yeah, this is a big one, and everyone, I'm sure, at the end of the day will look at budgets and can we afford to deploy the solutions that we're talking about. And if you can figure out a way to slow down the purchasing of Tier 1 disk, this is the $3 to $5 a gigabyte disk that you're probably using today for your high transaction processing critical systems. If you can get data off of there in such a way that the stuff that you don't need to read and write every day, put it out on a Verde at 48 cents a gig, and then eventually get it to tape at, I don't know, call it 10 cents a gig, the amount of money that you spend on hardware goes down significantly. That's the whole CapEx line there. And then the OpEx side, there's less people time spent managing the data on the drives. You can get it to an archive in disk and tape. It'll sit there for a very long time, and there's not much that needs to be done, and the things that need to be done we make very, very, very easy. So with that, we are 45 after the hour, and we have time for questions. How do you want to do this, Molly?
Wonderful.
Okay.
I'll tell you what, Bruce. I've got a list of some questions that have come in during the time you were talking. Most of these have to do with your product, but let's go with the first one, which is kind of a little more wide open. Are there any ceramic-based storage technologies for extremely long archive? The last ceramic-based storage technology I was familiar with were tablets that had the 15 commandments on them, and one of the tablets got dropped, and now we only have 10 commandments. I'm not aware of a silicon solution for archive. Flash storage has a tendency to release its captive bits within a year, and that's considered non-volatile. Volatile RAM, DRAM, and so forth, of course, loses all of its memory as soon as you disconnect power to it. So unless you're sure that you're going to have continuous streams of power to your volatile RAM, you're probably going to lose it there. Beyond that, ceramic-based storage, I'm not familiar with any technologies that are coming down the pike right now to solution in that space. Perhaps some of the carbon fiber stuff that is really, really deep laboratory experiment stuff at this point. But unless you're familiar with something that I'm not, Bruce, I would say that that's definitely end of life there, the whole ceramic idea.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to add anything more than what you just said, John.
Okay.
I will say one other thing I will say is at Spectra, we are very big into making sure that our roadmap thinks about future technology. So we are very deep with all of the disk drive and tape drive manufacturers looking out what's the next technology that will help lower the cost of storing data for a long period of time. So we are looking at future disk technologies, but that is a separate conversation to have under NDA someday.
Okay, and the next question actually has to do with N-Tier directly, so I'm just going to throw it out to you, Bruce. Can this N-Tier appliance also be used for standard disk-to-disk backup?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so there's two things I can think of there, depending on your environment and when you say disk-to-disk. If data resides on disk in a server or local disk or JBOD, and you want to do a backup to disk, absolutely. Verde is certified with the standard backup apps. As a matter of fact, we just We just released a solution brief that we wrote with Commvault to talk about how this all works with their Sympana software. But yeah, so as far as being a backup target, we look like an NFS or SIF store, and we would integrate with any disk-to-disk backup software that you're using today, since we're just a standard SIFs or NFS file store.
Okay, and in connection with that, another question came in. Does your front end on your Tier Verde product allow for client-side NFS, or does it allow for server-side NFS as well? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So from an NFS perspective, we don't care if it's server or client. And what that means is if you're running some kind of application, backup archive application, as long as the application has NFS as an output protocol, we're going to be perfectly well suited for that. The other thing that's interesting, and maybe this is where the question's coming from, on the client side, you don't need any special fancy software to do anything with us. We look like a massive file store. As a matter of fact, we have some of those customers that you saw on the logo slide aren't using canned software. They have such massive projects. I'll give you an example. One of our customers produces and distributes large amounts of video content. And what they're using us for is a temporary place to put video that doesn't need to be broadcast. Right? It's post-production. After it's produced, maybe it was broadcast last week, they're not ready to archive to tape because they might need it next week or next month. So they're manually moving these massive videos from disk that they're using, the very expensive disk, off to Verde, and they're doing it in a very manual way, just using standard NFS. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but yes, we can handle both client-side and server-side.
Okay, I want to get through a couple more questions about N-Tier before we jump in. We're getting a flood of questions now. Apparently everybody just was stimulated by your answer and has a ton of additional questions. But another quick question about N-Tier Verde, is there any peculiarity about does it require a specific or a special size server rack or anything?
No, standard rack. We don't require our own racks. Most anything that you have is going to work fine. Standard 19-inch rack.
Okay. Is it intended as an interim storage system, or is it an actual long-term archive repository, to your way of thinking?
That's a great question. I would say this. Depending on the size of your organization and the amount of data you have, there might be some of you out there that are thinking, I'm not using tape today. Maybe I don't want to go there. Maybe I do. But as an interim step, couldn't I just use this as my long-term archive? And the answer is absolutely yes. And what I'll say is, 1.7 petabytes goes a long way. It could store a lot of data for a lot of days, a lot of weeks, a lot of months, potentially a lot of years. And the way that our system's architected is such that when new disk drives come out, today 4 terabyte, are they going to go to 6 or 8 or 10 eventually? Yes, just a matter of when. When the new drives come out, our architecture allows you to replace old drives with new on the fly. So in theory, you could keep upgrading this system with new drives over time. So yes, it could be thought of as the resting place for data for a long time. For some larger organizations that have hundreds of petabytes, you're probably going to be looking at using this as a cache in front of a big tape behind it.
Okay. Is Verde qualified to be used as under, for example, Quantum's StoreNext for storage virtualization?
Yeah, so to my knowledge, we have not done any specific testing with StoreNext. So that's the glasses half empty answer. The glasses half full answer is I'm not a StoreNext expert, but as long as StoreNext writes to disk systems using NFS or SIFs, there's absolutely no reason this won't be supported as a disk option. So that's the best I can answer that one right now, John. If there's a specific project that involves StoreNext, please let us know. Whoever asked that question, we'll definitely follow back with you.
Okay, 2 more questions on Tier Verde, and then we have some really great questions that are coming in around the subject of archive generally. One is the network interface on Tier standard Ethernet, or is it meant for separate iSCSI or FCOE data networks?
We're actually using Token Ring.
Yeah.
All right, that was a joke. Yes, it's standard 10 gig E Ethernet, yes.
Okay, and second question is this box competitively priced compared to traditional SAN storage vendor prices, NetApp, HP Left Hand, et cetera, which I think means NAS?
Yeah, so what you'll find is Tier Verde is significantly less than the ones you just mentioned, and that's because first off, the hardware cost from the ones you just mentioned is very high. That's in the $3 to $5 a gig range. And then when you want feature functionality, many times there's extra costs around software. And you have the maintenance situation where once you buy a software package, you have to buy a maintenance contract on each and every piece of software. So the number that we're using here, 48 cents a gigabyte, is a list price that we can get to for a fairly large system. The dollar per gig will go up a little bit, maybe 50 to 60 cents a gig for smaller systems for list price, and that is very, very competitive. I can't do the math quickly in my head, but like 1/5 the cost of what you would pay for those more expensive systems. And what we're finding is a lot of our customers are simply using Verde as a way to lower their cost of buying more of those Tier 1 systems, right? So instead of saying, okay, I got to go buy a new NetApp because that's what we use for file storage, they might say, you know what, I'm going to archive some stuff out to Verde at 50 cents a gig, and I'm going to delay the purchase of my $5 a gig NetApp. So yes, it is very, very price competitive.
Okay, and then we had some other questions here that were general purpose questions about archive, and even a couple that were specific drill downs into Black Pearl technology. I believe those are going to be answered offline since we're approaching the top of the hour and the end of the show. I'd like to thank everybody who asked questions. I want to reassure people whose questions were not addressed that someone from SpectraLogic will be getting back to them probably via email within an acceptable time frame to provide answers to their questions. I liked those questions, by the way. I wish we had had more time to deal with them. One was on holographic storage, which is like the promised technology since the Kennedy administration, and we don't seem to be any closer to realizing it today than we were then. Anyway, thank you, everybody. Molly, I'm turning this back over to you, and thank you, Bruce. It was thoroughly enjoyable listening to your answers.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, guys. That was really great. Again, like John said, if you have any questions or if you ask questions, hopefully we can get back to you today or tomorrow. And if you have questions that you think of after this webinar or after you listen to the recording, if you weren't able to listen to the whole thing, then go ahead and send those to me or anyone who you have as a contact of Spectra, and we'll get those answered. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.